Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Officers from Bedfordshire Police raiding the home of a suspected drug dealer this morning, on a day that inspectors graded the force as inadequate, the worst force in England and Wales, a grading the Chief Constable blames on chronic underfunding.
This grading is not a correct grading for Bedfordshire. If you are going to talk about inadequate, then talk about inadequate resources and funding, and that's been the case in this force for some 10 years now.
Among the many failings, the inspectors found that antisocial behaviour, like this motorbike riding in a park in Dunstable, has soared, while Shannon McMahon told me she was assaulted on Boxing Day and has had an inadequate response.
When I called the police, they're like, yeah, we'll send someone out, and no one turned up until 3 days later. And then the guy went on leave until the 27th of last month, and I still haven't heard back.
While Bedfordshire Police was the only force branded inadequate, inspectors said they were raising a large and deep red flag about other forces, warning that they were arresting fewer people, shelving crimes without investigating properly, and failing to track down suspects relentlessly. While 2/3 of forces were rated as good or outstanding, the inspectors found that in some places local policing is being eroded. There's a national crisis in the severe shortage of detectives and a lack of grip in tracking down suspects, with that erosion of local policing the greatest concern.
Some forces are beginning to take officers out of neighbourhood policing to focus on other areas, and we're saying absolutely that erosion of neighbourhood policing cannot be allowed to happen.
But despite 8 years of austerity, the policing minister insisted this was not about forces being under-resourced.
So this is actually very clearly about how forces use those resources, how they're able to adapt, and what we are seeing is some of the really good police forces, judged as good, even outstanding, actually their per capita funding is lower than some of those who are failing.
Although crime has been falling, police are having to grapple with new issues like cybercrime and a wave of historic allegations of sexual offences. And as other public services like mental health have shrunk through austerity, the police have become the service of last resort. With money short, the inspectors found that some forces had been quicker to adapt to the new policing environment. Daniel Sanford, BBC News, Bedfordshire.
Well, our home editor Mark Eason's here with me. So, Mark, what is at the heart of the problem here? Is it funding or failing to adapt?
You know, Theresa May once said that the mission of the police was to cut crime, no more and no less. And if that's true, well, they've done pretty well, haven't they? We've seen budgets cut around 20% since 2010, but actually crime in that time has fallen by a third. But of course, we do expect the police to do rather more than that. And of the priority and emergency calls they receive, actually less than a quarter are directly crime-related. Police work, I think, has shifted from arresting villains, yes, they do that, much more about protecting victims, particularly, as we heard in the report, as other agencies have seen their budgets cut. So once detectives might have turned up at a front door and arrested a husband who'd hit his wife, but now they're also thinking about the safeguarding issues for the woman and for the children. So domestic violence, cybercrime, fraud, child sexual abuse we heard about earlier this week, these are complex crimes that have become much bigger priorities, and that's perhaps the real question we should ask. Are the police getting it right when it comes to 21st century priorities?
Mark, thank you.
Police in England and Wales is in a state of national crisis, according to a damning report by a police watchdog. The Inspectorate of Constabulary says victims are being let down, criminal cases shelved and suspects left on the run as police struggle to cope with the impact of budget cuts. The report says police are overstretched, hunting almost 46,000 suspects, including more than 1,000 rapists and 343 killers. There appear to be fewer bobbies on the beat too, with just 19% of the public seeing an officer in the past month. And while most forces were found to provide a largely good service, 13 forces across England and Wales were judged to be requiring improvement. Well, senior officers say funding is the problem, a claim rejected by ministers.
This isn't about the levels of funding, it's about how different police forces are using their funding. And actually, you've got Durham as an outstanding force, which has got per capita funding below some of those who are the highest funded in the country, who are being shown as needing improvement. So the funding levels aren't the issue. It's about how individual police forces are using their money in what they do locally.
Well, let's talk to our Home Affairs correspondent, Mark White. As we've heard, it's not just about the funding, because some forces are excelling while others are failing on the same budgets.
Yeah, it's not just about the funding, but that is a significant issue for police forces across England and Wales. They've had to contend with a 22% cut in their budgets over the past 5 years, and that's meant that there are 34,000 fewer police officers and civilian staff working for these forces. And of course, they were involved in a job. They're not there anymore. Other people, other police officers and civilian staff have to pick up the slack. And for chief constables, they have to prioritise and make some really difficult decisions about the types of crime they give priority to going forward. Some chief constables are getting it right. Others, clearly, according to the HMIC report, are not getting it right and really need to start to improve. We spoke a little earlier to Steve White, who is the chair of the Police Federation of England and Wales, and he said it's time really for an honest conversation now between the government, the public, to try to determine what it is they want from their police service at a time when they are having to grapple with reduced funding.
We are seeing officers saying, actually, whilst I signed up to work really hard, they don't shy away from work, and I want to serve the public, but they're finding it increasingly difficult to do so. And of course, it's very frustrating when you feel as though you're being restricted, because despite us saying that we're beginning to be unable to cope, people don't seem to be listening. I mean, the government said they're going to protect police funding last year, but that's after they've taken an awful lot out. We've got to start having a proper conversation with the public over what they want their police service to deliver for them and how much they're prepared to spend.
Meanwhile, Mark, some news of new tasers to be brought into use.
Yeah, this is a new, more capable, in some ways a more powerful taser that the police have been trialling and looking at for the last few months. It's called the X2. You're looking at video from Taser International off that particular weapon, a less lethal weapon, not a non-lethal weapon. It has been linked to a number of deaths, although the direct causal links have not yet been established. But effectively, this X2 taser is seen as more appropriate for the police because it allows an officer to fire 2 shots at a suspect. If the first shot doesn't work, they've got the option of a second shot before they then have to reload. The problem with the X26, the current taser that they've had for 13 years, is that is becoming increasingly obsolete. They're finding it difficult to get replacement parts for it. But crucially, it only fires 1 shot, and then if that doesn't connect with a suspect, the officer has to take out a new cartridge and put that into the weapon at a time when he may be struggling with someone who could be armed. So the obvious risks are plain to see there. But there are those critics of taser who believe that it is because it is a less lethal weapon and has been linked to a number of deaths, that really the whole issue around taser needs to be reviewed, because there are many more instances of taser being deployed and used by police officers now than there ever was, and these critics believe it's time for a proper review going forward.
OK, Mark, thank you. Let's get more on that story now. We can speak to police officer Laura Beale, who says she felt compelled to resign this week after 13 years of working for Devon and Cornwall Police. Ms Beale, who was featured on publicity posters for the force, put her resignation letter on her Facebook page, and it has now gone viral. Good to speak to you. You've handed in your notice. Just explain to us why you felt compelled to do that after so long on the force.
I've been feeling like I needed to do it for an awful long time now, but due to wanting to stick at it and look after my colleagues, you stay. But my health and my mental health and my physical health was deteriorating so much, I was just left with no option but to have to leave.
But explain to us how your health deteriorated. What caused that to happen in terms of your day-to-day job?
The stress of it is too much. There's not enough of us out there. There's to police the area that we're supposed to be policing, and what they're trying to ask us to do on a day-to-day basis is just it's physically impossible to be able to do. So many people are at breaking point, but due to the fact that the police officers that I've always worked with are so professional, they keep it going. They keep the wheel on. Unfortunately, I got to a point where I couldn't, and it was. Despite trying very, very, very hard, I couldn't do it anymore. It was too much.
Did you feel at any point that your life was being put in danger because there weren't maybe the numbers of you that should be going out on any given patrol?
Yeah, very much so, and that does sound like quite a very big statement to make, but I think it's true. I think if you belittle it, people just brush over it, but you can't. Two police officers on patrol is not acceptable, covering the whole of mid-Devon, and you've just got to look at the figures of the near misses, but I'm sure that they're not going to be put up. But the amount of people that are blue lighting 45 minutes to get to a job at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're the only one there, and then you're going to have to come back and complete paperwork. It's just not expected. It's impossible to be able to keep going like that for 30 years. That's why the turnover rate is so short, and everybody wants to leave.
You say in your letter that it's run more like a business now. How so?
Just in the way in which they approach the people that we deal with, and also ourselves, as police officers. We're not. I don't think it's taken into consideration what we actually have to do on a day-to-day basis, and we are just a number. And you can't treat police officers, any emergency staff, anybody that's under as much pressure that is put on us. You can't just go, oh, don't worry, you can do that. Just crack on with it. And you can't physically do that. We are human beings first and foremost. We're not numbers. And if you keep putting that pressure on, we're going to pop. It's all well and good doing wellness programs, but when there's not enough of us, all you're doing is you're shutting the door once the horse has bolted. You need more people. You need backup, and we don't have it.
Do you have any examples of when the system has completely cracked?
I don't have any. There's just so many. You're looking at it going log after log after log. I think that the main example is the fact that there are too few, and if when you're getting called from one side of Devon to the other to cover an immediate, which could mean that it takes up to 45 minutes to an hour to get to an immediate, leaving a whole area policed by one person, or in some cases no people. I think that's enough to show you as an example as to what it's like. Anything specific, and when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about frontline stuff. So if you dial 999 and want a police officer, there's not enough of us there to physically deal with it properly.
What are the coping mechanisms that your colleagues employ to get through every day?
Humour, I think. Humour amongst colleagues, basically. You have to be able to have to vent with each other, and you have to be able to have a laugh and have a joke within. But because there's so few of us, we aren't able to bounce off each other as much as we used to. And the experience of older police officers, because they're all going because they don't want to do their full time anymore, they can't give that experience of how to handle stressful situations to the younger police officers that are coming in. I know that I was taken under the wing of some fantastic, well-experienced police officers. That you're looking at the police officers with 2 or 3 years service as being the most experienced on some sections, and when you're being asked to deal with such dangerous circumstances and situations, how are they expected to deal with that without the experience and the guidance from other police officers? I don't know.
You say that you love the job and you followed your father into the force, joining in 2004. So, I mean, it's in the family, this profession. Is there anything that the force could say to you today to make you change your mind and to stay in the job that you love?
Wow. I'd like them to apologise for the way that they treat, not me. I don't need an apology to me, but I think an apology through how they treat everybody, and just by actually starting to put people first, put police officers first, and make them just come out and see what it's like. Don't come out when it's been organised. Just pop in on a Saturday night when there's like 2 of us stood outside of a nightclub. Just pop in then and come and spend a whole shift and spend a whole weekend doing what we have to do for that, and then see what it's really like. You don't get that. nothing will make me go back now because it made me so ill. But to answer your question, they need to have a massive shake-up. And basically, to cut a long story short, both with the NHS in particular as well, get more staff out on the front line. It's where it's needed.
OK. Laura Bill, thank you for speaking to us, laying down the gauntlet there that the senior official should come out and spend a day, walk in her shoes on the beat for one day. Thank you for speaking to us.
Money is tight, staff are in short supply, the system is struggling to cope. That's the story across the public sector, for the police, for the health service, for schools. More on the last two in a moment, but first, a new report by the police watchdog has warned of worrying signs of deterioration in the performance of some forces. It warns victims are being let down, cases are not being investigated, and suspects are still on the loose. But it's not just a shortage of cash. The report calls on chief constables to use their limited resources more effectively. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Darshna Soni, reports.
OK, if you can just calm down for me, I'll take some details from you, OK? When did this happen?
It's busier than usual in Nottinghamshire Police's control room. We've been allowed in to film how they're responding to emergencies.
In a day, we can take anything up to 1,500 calls a day. Wow. And so far, we're standing at around 700.
Nottinghamshire is one of 13 requiring improvement because of the way it responds to emergencies. The police watchdog has found some forces downgrade 999 calls when there's a shortage of officers to justify a slower response time.
Some calls are being put in a priority list, and clearly it's the top ones that are dealt with, the most harmful ones to begin with, but those that are not emergencies are put lower down and are come to at a later date.
But, the Commissioner says, the report has to be seen in the context of the cuts that the force has faced.
Here in Nottinghamshire, we've had to make savings of 25% or £54 million over the past 5 years. Stands to reason, given cuts like that, you've got to make hard choices about priorities.
But is it all about money? Because some other forces that have also had cuts are doing better than yours.
There's one force that's outstanding. That shows really that all forces are under strain.
And that strain, the inspectorate has found, has meant neighbourhood policing has suffered. Only a fifth of the public say they've seen a local bobby in the last month.
What I don't like is the response of the police. Because, for example, my wife just had an accident a few weeks ago, and the police took like 2 hours to come down to nearly 2 hours to come down to the scene.
Even if you phone them, they don't come. So, you know, I mean, my granddaughter had a front of a house vandalised with spray paint. Never even bothered to come out.
The report suggests that policing is in a potentially perilous state. Inspectors found what they called dangerous and disturbing practices as forces struggle with huge budget cuts. But the watchdog says it's not all down to money because there's a huge variation in the way different forces are coping.
Of the 43 police forces in England and Wales, inspectors found that the service provided in Bedfordshire was inadequate. 13 others, including Nottinghamshire, were judged to require improvement. 28 were found to be good. And there was only one force, Durham, rated as outstanding.
We're seeing worrying signs of deterioration in some forces, of demand being suppressed, of rationing happening as an unintended consequences of responses to austerity.
But in the context of those austerity cuts, the debate has become highly politicised, with the government insisting that police funding has been protected.
The money issue doesn't correlate. What it is about is how local police forces are using their resources to deliver locally.
Police budgets have fallen by 22% in the last 5 years. The inspectorate found that as a result, investigations are being shelved, suspects remain at large. Because of an increased workload, it's harder to recruit and retain detectives.
If you think about some of the pressures with regards to child sexual abuse investigations, particularly some of the historic stuff which we're massively invested in at the same time as dealing with the day-to-day stuff, you know, workloads, we have to be very careful that we're keeping those as manageable as possible.
Forces are under further pressure because of cuts to local authority budgets. As this report makes clear, we may all have to rethink how much we're prepared to pay for policing and what service we expect the police to provide. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Nottinghamshire.
Now, patient safety is a real concern in 80% of England's hospitals, according to the latest report from top hospital inspector Professor Sir Mike Richards. Rising demands for care and budget pressures are creating difficult-to-manage situations that are putting patient care at risk. But without urgent changes, Professor Richards warns hospitals cannot continue to meet the needs of today's population.
Hospitals, GP services, care homes need to work much more closely together. We're seeing that happening in some parts of the country, in Northumbria, in Salford, in other parts of the country too. We need to accelerate that so that we get that change across the whole country.
Well, it's a numbers problem worthy of even the toughest Michael Gove-inspired GCSE, funding different schools in different parts of England completely fairly. Well, after years of lobbying from areas which claimed they'd been underfunded, the government has come up with a proposed new so-called fairer funding formula. But it's causing outrage from East Devon to West Sussex to Barnsley and beyond. I've been to meet some of the schools which would be winners, but who still say they're losing out. In schools across the country, it's not just the pupils who've got some tough sums to do. For years, successive governments have faced criticism that the way schools are funded is unfair, with some given around £7,000 a pupil, while others get by on half that. Now this government has put forward plans for a new, they say fairer, funding formula. Half of England's schools will get more money. So why are so many of the supposed winners saying they'll be worse off? We start our journey in the southeast, in Essex.
So what's happening in this stanza?
At Great Baddow High School in Chelmsford, they be some of the lucky ones, in theory at least. Under the new fair funding formula, you're a gainer.
In theory, yes, we're a gainer. I think we are due to receive approximately 0.5%, which is about £30,000. But if I can tell you that at Christmas we had a gas leak and we're only able to open because we were able to pay £36,000 to fix it, then that perhaps puts the £30,000 into some sort of context.
Like 60% of secondaries across England, this school is already in debt. And at the same time as the planned new funding formula is introduced, all schools face a budget squeeze. The National Audit Office say extra costs and inflation mean all schools are facing an 8% budget cut by 2020. All round, the head says the impact will be devastating.
Subjects like modern foreign languages, A-level music, could disappear from our A-level offers in my own school and elsewhere.
And what do you make of that?
I think it's a very, very short-sighted policy, if I can call it a policy, because on one hand, government are trying to encourage schools to enable all students to study a modern foreign language, and yet that opportunity might then cease at A-level if those groups aren't sustainable.
Because remember when this was written?
Across Essex, secondary heads are now joining forces to lobby the government for more money. They say the repeated rhetoric that education has never been better funded simply doesn't tell the whole story.
Well, we believe it's being disingenuous to say that it's cash flat funding for education. That bit is true, but we believe it's disingenuous not to also say that the government itself is imposing lots of unfunded costs onto schools.
London, historically enjoying some of the highest funding, will see 637 schools gain, but more than 1,500 will be worse off, an average loss per pupil of £333. Devon, an area which has long lobbied for a new funding formula, will see 212 schools gain, but 129 worse off than before, enraging local Tory MPs. Our next stop, a big winner in Barnsley. Penistone Grammar School, only a grammar in name now, has the lowest per pupil basic funding in all of Barnsley, and Barnsley itself is one of the lowest funded areas in the country. It's set to gain by nearly 11%, but as there's a cap of 3% in the next few years, staff say it won't even make a dent in the school's debt, which rises by £1,000 a day.
The reality of such desperate funding is definitely, hitting us day in, day out, and it's only set to get worse.
And what do you feel about that as a teacher, as a head teacher?
It feels morally wrong. Why should our students have to suffer?
With the consultation on the new formula due to close at the end of the month, the students themselves are keen to make their voice heard.
If we make a noise about it and what we're doing in campaigning, then the government, I think, will listen to us.
Are you as confident the government will listen?
I think they're more likely to listen to us rather than, leading unionists and teachers and all that, because I think if they listen to us and they hear what we have to say, then they know how much of a real impact it is actually having on our education.
Redistributing funding for schools is something they've been desperate for here, but they think the government isn't going far enough, fast enough. The gap between schools must be closed, they say, and if that means taking more from schools in places like London, fair enough.
Education is a north-south divide. Ofsted talk about it, Children's Commissioner talks about it, everyone talks about it. Some things are really, really simple. If Barnsley is massively underfunded, give us more money.
Give Barnsley more money means that maybe schools in somewhere like London have to lose some.
If you take a child in year 7 or 8, we can't take money off them. They've had advantage for many, many years. All they will do is, over time, get to the same number that we have. So the idea that London schools are losers in this is just completely false.
In a statement today, the Department for Education said funding was at the highest level on record and that it was determined to create a more equal system of funding schools. But with many MPs, including Conservatives, joining forces with heads and parents to say the proposed funding formula is far from fair, will the government be forced to think again? Well, we asked the Education Secretary and Schools Minister to come on the programme. Neither were available, nor were any Conservative members of the Education Select Committee. But with me in the studio is Jo Yerke, a parent and co-founder of the Fair Funding for All Schools campaign, and Jules White, the head teacher of a school in West Sussex. And in Leeds is David O'Hara, who you saw in that report. He's the chair of governors at Penistone Grammar in Barnsley. Jules White, what is the situation for your school at the minute?
It's really very bad. Last year I had to find £250,000 saving. This coming year it's £350,000, and there's only one real way to do that, and that's actually losing teaching staff. I lost 3 last year. We didn't replace 5 members of administrative support, and I'm having to make further cuts in even things like cleaning, premises staff, my IT provision, and matters are just getting worse and worse. I'm even having to look at the moment about making cuts to vital counselling services for some of our most vulnerable pupils.
Now, West Sussex was one of the areas that lobbied for this fair funding formula, and theoretically you're a winner, aren't you? What is there still to complain about?
That was meant to be the case in theory. The funding formula itself has been delayed for over a year. We were told by the DfE to wait and matters will get better, but superficially that happens, but the reality is quite different. So, for example, in my school, we'll go up by around about 3%, which is £180,000. It's not enough, but it would be better. But at the same time, we're receiving huge unfunded cuts of around about 8 to 10%. They amount to £200,000. So I didn't think my school could get any worse off, but actually in 2018 it will do.
Jo Yerke, 10 of the highest funded areas in the country are all in London. And if an area, where your school is, say, gets 6,000 a pupil roughly, and Jules' school gets just over 4,000. Isn't it fair that there should be this redistribution of cash?
Well, we support the principle of a new national funding formula. We agree that historical injustice in the funding of our schools needs to be addressed. Our concern is that what's proposed doesn't amount to justice for anyone. And that's because it's based on a redistribution of a pot of money that we already know isn't big enough to sustain our schools adequately. And I think that even those that lobbied for the formula did so on the basis that they were underfunded, not on the basis that other schools were overfunded. And I think it's really a lie to put across the idea that there are any rich schools in the context of real terms cuts, the largest that we've seen for 30 years. If that were true, then why in the area of London, for example, that I live, is there a school asking parents to contribute towards its £100,000 deficit that it's got? Why is there a school down the road from where I live that had to lose a teaching post, lose a teaching assistant post, reduce its special educational needs by 40%, cut its music club and cut its science club?
David O'Hara, you said in the piece there's a north-south divide. Barnsley is desperately in need of more money, and in essence, if that had to come from other schools in London, that was right.
Well, I think I would agree with sort of Joel and Joe that there are two issues really here. The first is the size of the cake, and everyone in education would love to have a bigger cake. You talked about 6 or 8% increase, a 6% increase over the next few years. We'd love a bigger cake. Will we get that from the Chancellor next week? I very much doubt it. So we're going to have to deal with a cake that's massively unfairly split. And so if you look at my school, for example, should have an additional £700,000. The average loss in London is under £10,000 from the funding formula. So I think, yeah, the burning injustice is just huge, and we're in this together, and I think London may just have to give a little bit more than it's currently doing.
Jo Yerke first on that.
Well, I think the government would very much like to set school communities against each other because, of course, what they want to do is not to fund the promise that they made. Now, the promise that they made to parents was to introduce this new funding formula. One would have thought that they would have had to cost that and to provide the funds to level schools up. I don't think anybody lobbied on the basis of dragging schools down. It was about bringing schools funding up.
But David O'Hara does make a good point that the government have suggested there is no greater cake and there has to be some way of slicing it up.
Well, I don't think we should be that pessimistic. We need to make sure all of our schools are funded absolutely adequately. One of the problems is that the DFE doesn't know actually how much we need to do that. They need to do much more work on that. They need to accept that it's no good introducing a new funding formula that doesn't take into account huge unfunded costs. And actually, there is money around if the political will was there. We saw a year ago, if you wanted to become an academy, you're going to be forced to become an academy. £500 million, £500 million was made available. Within seconds of the grammar school announcement coming out, the Chancellor found £150 million. Free schools has been an absolute disaster in terms of efficiency.
The reality is, though, David O'Hara would say that the South has a much bigger slice of the pie that's available than the North, and that needs redistributing.
Well, that's not the case, obviously, in West Sussex, in Cornwall, in Dorset. Everyone knows those figures. My school is one of the lowest funded across England. But what we've actually got to do is address the problem that schools are the lifeblood, and the children that we serve are the lifeblood of our communities. If we want to make sure that we've got really high levels of skills, then we have to invest properly. Nobody wants a settlement that is unrealistic, but we must have a fair one, and one that's manageable.
David O'Hara.
But I think I agree about more money, and it will be fantastic, and I'm sure schools in the South and London have a big issue. But when Justine Greening launched the consultation, she said that a child in Hackney could get 50% more than a child in Barnsley with the same background and so on. That will be 40% difference in 3 years' time. So we're getting nowhere close to a fair funding formula. We have to give schools like mine in Barnsley a much bigger amount faster. And I know it's hard, but if we don't get 3 or 4 billion from the government next week, which we won't do, we're just going to have to share things out between us more fairly.
But David,
isn't that the realistic picture?
No, I don't think so, because our parent campaign is bringing together parents from the worst funded areas and the so-called best funded areas. So I think what we're saying is that parents expect the government to deliver on the promises they made to us.
But I mean, we've watched in the programme earlier on, we have, really serious problems within the police, within the NHS. Look, you're looking for a bigger share of funding. Where does it come from? If it comes for schools, where do you take it out of?
The point is actually £3 billion is being taken out of education. We just want the size of the cake to remain adequate. David's absolutely right. The point of the National Fair Funding was to provide better stability, greater transparency, and to reduce the gaps. At the moment, what the National Funding Formula does is it actually tries to take away from schools in perhaps London and other metropolitan areas which are actually adequately funded, whilst at the same time it doesn't even give the low-funded schools, whether in Barnsley or West Sussex, enough money. And the government really do need to rethink this, and they have got a way of doing it, but they actually want to pursue projects that aren't viable.
Well, I think the question should be, can we really afford not to invest in our schools? Because no funds, no future. It's as simple as that. We're going to be leaving the European Union. We need to make sure that we have children or people that have the skills that we're going to need to grow our economy for ourselves. If we don't invest in our schools, we won't have that.
Really sorry, we're going to have to end it there. I would like to come back to you, David. I'm sorry we couldn't. Thank you so much, all of you. Thanks a lot.